So does current Warhammer 40k have an issue with points across the board being just a bit too low? Let's talk about this common talking point for 10th edition, and if it even is a problem, then talk about ways in which you could work against it. Hello and welcome back to Auspex Tactics, where today I thought it could be interesting to return to the discussion topic of Warhammer 40k points being a little bit low. Maybe something that perhaps affects certain armies than others, though it has definitely been something that's a talking point in 10th edition, just with quite a lot of armies in the game maybe having perhaps surprisingly underwhelming rules compared with what you might expect from the lore, and then having balanced adjustments to help them out by chopping their points cost down, and just meaning that you can put more stuff on the table. I've certainly touched on this in videos in the past. It does seem to be a feeling amongst a fair few players that Warhammer 40k's got a bit more Horde in 10th edition. Some units that are weak only being made effective by being cheap in these balance updates with points, as opposed to being powerful models on an individual level and kind of balanced versus the rest. For this video I'm not talking about the points of any individual poorly performing faction or unit right now. There's certainly some things that are just overcosted that absolutely do need a points cut. I'm more trying to focus on the general theme of things within Warhammer 40k as a whole. At least in the first few months of 10th edition, it seems that it's at least partly been the balance passes that have broadly caused this to happen. In general, I certainly think that the balance passes that Games Workshop does are a very good thing. People want their units to be at least usable, compared with the days where they didn't bother to update any of their rules or points costs. There's now far more units in the game that are very playable in one form or another, and less of the horrendous broken problems that didn't get fixed in 7th edition and earlier. In 10th edition in particular, it did just start out that there were a bunch of factions that had very strong faction-specific rules, and some armies that had very weak ones, and then that gives Games Workshop the choice of whether they try and rebalance things either with points changes or rules changes, their usual philosophy tending to be slightly more on points versus rules, although they do both. In general, they tend to buff things more than they nerf things, and that's generally considered kind of good game design in its own right outside of Warhammer 40k, I understand, even if some things you absolutely do need to tone down the strongest power combos. And in general, the vast majority of unit changes tend to be points changes as opposed to overall faction rules. And again, I think that also makes sense, as if you just keep on changing datasheet rules and individual statistics all over the place, people are just going to get very confused. At least by keeping most changes to points focused, you don't have to mess with how every single unit functions in game from balance patch to balance patch. So maybe not surprising that between the two of those, the factions that had the worst performing rules have gone down in points costs, sometimes by quite a lot. I was interested to get your feelings on this, and I did a channel poll recently to ask whether or not you consider that points in the game are too low in Warhammer 40k in general. It does seem that common talking point does look like it's a majority view, 66% versus 34% who think that they aren't. Though even though it's a majority, it's definitely not any sort of consensus. Plenty of people are absolutely happy with the way they are, so it doesn't really make sense to pretend that this is a major issue for literally everyone out there. I feel like some players' experiences might really vary a bit between army to army. There's certainly some factions where it feels like this has got to a bit of a problematic extent, and plenty of armies out there that actually have points costs that are quite high relative to the past. I would also put this into historical context as well. Previous edition hordes have certainly been very big compared with what they are now as well. For example, in 8th edition and prior, we had some extremely cheap horde units, which I'd consider to be more of a real horde by 40k standards. Say, for example, we had times when Imperial Guard conscripts were just 3 points per model, and there were times where you could theoretically put 300 to 500 models on the board if you wanted to. Some of the time it wasn't even a particularly bad idea. That was more in the era though when Warhammer 40k was a long way from where it was today in terms of clever missions and movement shenanigans and things like that. We could absolutely try and maximise competitively, but it felt like perhaps there was just a little bit less point back then. Perhaps a lot more scope for things just being affected by random chance and matchups and things, with the missions not really working quite as well for just more take-all-comers conflicts. I think in one of the many changes they made when they were trying to make 40k a bit more playable at a higher level, limiting the ability of hordes to get quite this big in most games was probably a sensible move. If it's all very important to be dominating the board and standing on objectives, allowing things like a theoretical 500-point model perhaps being one of the best ways to play the game would be kind of dumb really, as very few people have got time for that sort of thing, and it might just not be practical to actually play at, say, tournaments or whatever, even if in theory land it could be quite good. In general though, perhaps the criticisms of this edition are more that certain elite units perhaps are very low in points cost compared with how they've been in the past, and again definitely affecting some armies more so than others. Perhaps one good example of this at the moment I'd say might be the Tau Riptide. 165 points does feel weirdly cheap for a model that's quite this big, imposing, and expensive in monetary terms. In the past, Riptides have typically been more in the sort of 200 to 300 point bracket in a 2000 point list, and it just feels very strange to have them costed all the way down to 165 points, being pretty good on the durability front, though kind of pillow-fisted on the damage output, despite having all the appearance of a massive battlesuit with a truly enormous ion gun. You'd expect maybe might be a little bit more devastating against enemy tanks and vehicles. I feel like the Tau range in general has definitely become a bit more expensive to collect than it was in previous editions. The points cuts at the start of 10th edition definitely were in line with that, the army being very underpowered, then improved by big points cuts as opposed to rules boosts. The same is maybe true of Death Guard as well. They started out 10th in about as weak a spot as they could possibly be, and then Games Workshop both gave them points cuts and rules buffs to try and get them back in line, to which I'd say they'd succeeded, at least in terms of external balance. They're around about a 50% win percentage now, so I'd say it's worked from that point of view. It has led to some people having some gripes with the overall feel of the army though, some examples being things like Plague Marines and Blight Lord Terminators being good examples. Both of these you'd expect to be really quite elite and disturbingly resilient against enemy firepower, no doubt, though really they're only just kind of durable due to being cheap at the moment, the Blight Lords at 33 points being the cheapest Terminators in Warhammer 40k, and they're not even outcompeting the Death Shroud at that sort of points cost, and the Plague Marines at sub 20 points, again maybe aren't feeling like the crack troops of Nurgle that laugh off most enemy attacks and firepower. I feel like if you ask the average Death Guard player if you could have some sort of rule to make durability across the army go up a bit, and do that at the expense of points going up a little bit too, I suspect most might take you up on that offer. With the units being insanely cheap thing though, AMEC really are the best example here. From the start of 10th edition, the main criticism was that they just have all sorts of skirmishy type units that just don't really do very much damage whatsoever. Maybe contributing factors are the 10th edition toughness chart, meaning that a lot of things that are good against infantry aren't really very good against heavies or anything, and also the fact that the faction went down from broadly hitting on ballistic skill 3+ to broadly hitting on a 4+, and also AP nerfs across the board in Warhammer 40k did hit quite a few of their units. It meant that at the start of 10th edition they just had lots of small elite skirmish units that cost quite a lot in terms of money terms, but are absolutely dirt cheap on the board. Things like the Tabaxi, Sicarians, and Cerberus being fairly good examples, I guess. In 9th edition they could certainly be massively hoardy as well, but wound up at least having some somewhat high points per models in the later phases of the edition, just due to the sheer amount of stacking synergies that they could put on units, which isn't really the case in the 10th edition more simplified rule set. AdMech do really feel like the archetype of the army that's too much horde at the moment, their game plan often being to spam lots of small, cheap, mobile and toughish units to control the board and score points, while at least plenty of armies might not have all that much plan for winning the damage game against the enemy, and that doesn't really feel like the place that most people want to play with. Otherwise, just for a few more scattergun examples, Space Marines generally have far worse points per dollar than they used to in the past. The Astartes perhaps don't feel quite as elite as they used to be, lots of their troops units tending to sit around the 16 point per model sort of area, which definitely is lower than it was in the past. Kind of weird to see the at least fairly hard hitting jump intercessors down to 80 points now. Leagues of Votan had similar sort of changes to the Death Guard, starting out 10th super weak and getting points cuts to boost them, as well as their rules changed. The change between 9th and 10th edition for them has been kind of jarring, mainly due to the 9th edition judgment tokens just being kind of horrendously powerful, and getting the tones down versions of those meant that their units' points needed to drop to compensate. Finally, the Adeptus Custodes often tend to be an army where people would much rather see rules buffs versus points drops. Their whole thing is hyper eliteness. It means that even if their basic models have kind of similar points cost to other factions' Terminators, then people get a little bit less happy about that. I do kind of wonder if we might see further points cuts for those if their codex does wind up being a bit underpowered after the rules nerfs there, though I guess they still might have the option of adding in some protection against devastating wounds to add a bit more value. I wouldn't say it's the case for everything though. There's plenty of armies that have had actual kind of points increases versus prior editions. Eldaria probably the single best example, given that Games Workshop just gave them some ludicrously scary index rules between Fate Dice and the Battle Host rerolls. Things like Fire Prisms have gone from an initial 120 points or so up to 180, and other things like the Avatars, Warp Spiders, and Night Spinners all are costed at a big premium compared with where they were. Genes to the Cults are maybe another one as well. They're in a place where they're arguably less hoardy than they used to be in prior editions. Their whole cult ambush respawn thing means that individual units can be priced a bit more expensive to show the value for that. And between that and a good combat patrol, it's got to the point where they're not really one of the most expensive factions in Warhammer 40k anymore, which they absolutely were before. In any case though, it still is a trend for quite a lot of armies in 40k, even if it's not all of them, and I would argue it does cause some downsides to players. The most obvious one that usually gets brought up when Games Workshop is concerned is the monetary cost of armies. I think people often might try and ascribe Games Workshop a bit too much cleverness in terms of making 3D chess moves to try and get people to buy more models, though it definitely does seem a little bit suspect. When the average Warhammer army might need more models to complete it now, that does mean that you're likely to spend more money with Games Workshop's kits. I certainly wouldn't be too surprised if a few factions have been nudged into a few more sales due to units dropping in points cost, but it's not like they don't do enough nudges for that sort of thing in general, with balance updates, cycling around the things that are good or bad in game, and releasing detachments that you might need extra units to build out to a critical mass of a certain amount of units. I feel like even Games Workshop don't want to let this get too out of hand though, as it gets to the point where the sheer amount of cost that you have for some factions might be a huge turn off in itself. A 2,000 point AdMech army could certainly run you in the region of around about 1,500 to 2,000 US dollars. If you go for a few of the more expensive units, it could even be over $2,000 if you absolutely try and maximise the worst returns on that way. New recruits certainly seem to be in that sort of trend as well. If you wanted a force of any given size of that, it's going to cost you an awful lot if you're going for the new plastic kits for them. They've got pretty bad points per dollar ratios themselves. Otherwise, beyond expense type things, it's maybe not all that helpful for practical gaming as well. You can only slash points cost so much before it becomes impractical and problematic, as I think we're seeing with the AdMech. Some 2,000 point armies have certainly scaled up a bit in 10th, and it might be an annoyance to players if you have to have a serious amount of models on the tabletop each time you're playing a game of 40k, when previously you could have got by with just a few big ones perhaps. Otherwise, perhaps the other major loss is theming. 40k is a setting that's just littered with powerful super soldiers and scary units that are supposed to be really good in their own way against all sorts of different fields. I think people generally tend to get a bit unhappy if their miniatures just feel like they're kind of rubbish against things that you think they might be able to do quite well against in the lore. And that's the sort of thing that changing points cost doesn't really help with too much. If their datasheets and indexes have rules that just don't really make them all that scary, then dropping points cost repeatedly is only going to make you feel like you're just getting more of a bad unit, as opposed to the unit being good outright. And you definitely can make weak datasheets strong in game that way, but it maybe isn't the way that people want them to be good. Maybe Reavers could be an example for that, not really played competitively at 85 points at all. It certainly could drop them down to very low points values, maybe something like 14 points per model or similar to that. It does just feel a bit weird though that these Spec Ops Space Marines are only being considered, say, the same points cost as like a Chaos Accursed Cultist, or just a little bit more than an Astra Militarum Kazakin, for example. For both perspectives, I feel like the easiest way to fix these things are in codex and rules updates. In general, the codex is the time that you've got to hope that Games Workshop gets on top of this if it is indeed a problem to people. As realistically as mentioned, they're not going to go through every single datasheet in the balance pass and change a whole bunch of stats and things around to make them overall feel better. I feel like they may have had a few hits and misses with this in 10th edition so far. Certainly one of the ones that people have felt worst about are things like Custodes, Dark Angels, and AdMech, all of which felt like they were codexes that nerfed more than they buffed in datasheet terms, and then are going to have to be evened out by points cuts unless they do something creative with a balanced data slate. I feel like, say, for Dark Angels and Custodes, they weren't really armies where people wanted the individual models to be less powerful. More they'd like to keep the same sort of power that they had and just pay a few more points for them if Games Workshop felt that was really necessary. Otherwise, to make things feel a bit more elite, you could mess with an army rule as they did with, say, Death Guard and Leaguers of Votann. They did do that hand in hand with points cuts, but I guess you could argue that if they hadn't done the significant improvements to core rules for those armies, then the points cost for those factions would have had to be even lower if they didn't give them some boosted judgment tokens or contagions, so it's probably for the best that they did both. Sounds like they're aware enough of the problem that that's probably going to happen to AdMech next balanced data slate. They said that something's coming for the codex next time round. It could be some sort of simple universal datasheet enhancement, like hitting better on better weapon skill or ballistic skill, or perhaps more likely something to buff their core rules, potentially even a complete rewrite. Otherwise, though, besides individually looking at each individual faction and changing rules for them, you could do something like a universal points rise if Games Workshop just thought that there was too many models on the table and that was problematic for 40k in general. They certainly have done that in the past. They did it in the transition between 8th edition to 9th edition, where basically everything went up by varying degrees, usually around about a 10% points increase. So it meant that things that basically went up 5% was essentially a buff, or if you went up by more than 10%, that was maybe a nerf versus the rest of the field. I feel like maybe a fair few players, though, that weren't particularly engaged with their entire balance discussion around that, and generally got a bit annoyed with them saying, "Why are you nerfing my army?" even if it wasn't really a nerf in the context of everything going up. I'd also guess that any sort of big sweeping points rise like that would likely create a lot of initial imbalance as well. It certainly felt like it in the early stages of 9th edition. It's just hard to know with certain units with what granularity they should go up. You literally can't do an each 10% points increase for things that are lower than 10 points. And it's not that easy for bigger units either, where they might be in increments of 5 these days. I really wouldn't be too surprised if they pulled a similar sort of thing in the eventual transition from 10th edition to 11th if they do think things are getting out of hand. Finally, though, I definitely think it's worth mentioning that if you're just a bit bored of playing with quite so many models on the tabletop, as at least seems to be the case for some of you out there, there's one very easy fix, which is just to play at lower points totals. It's not going to be universally helpful, but you don't really need to wait for Games Workshop to take action if you don't want to play as big games of Warhammer 40k. I know that in the more competitive discussion, everyone seems to fixate on 2000 points, but in reality, in more casual games, loads of games tend to happen at far below that sort of points ratio. Playing at something like 1750 or 1500 points could take the edge off the model requirements for a big 2000 point game, and you can certainly go lower. Lots of people enjoy 1000 point games, for example. My personal feeling is that I'd rather play with like sort of scalar rules there. So, say having Genestealer Cult being able to bring 1/4 of their points as Brood Brothers as they can in 2k or 1000 points, and the same general feeling with Inari bringing, say, a half their points as Drukari. This wouldn't help with the criticism of certain units maybe feeling like thematically they're not as valuable as they should be in the lore, but it does help with just the practical model load for, say, transporting models or buying in models to field an entire army. And this one's just a really simple, easy fix where you can still have a great game of 40k with a whole load of units on the table. It just doesn't have to be that you always commit to the 2000 point game that's considered the gold standard by many. In any case, though, look forward to hearing your thoughts down in the comments below. Do you think that Warhammer 40k's points are too low at the moment, or do you think they're about right where they are? Look forward to hearing your thoughts and what, if anything, Games Workshop should do about it as a result. If you've enjoyed the video, then feel free to subscribe to Auspex Tactics. I'll certainly keep the regular 40k videos coming. I do tend to post new ones just about every day. Finally, if you have been enjoying all the videos on the channel, I would just like to mention that Auspex Tactics does have a Patreon page as well, and you can find that linked in the video description if you'd like to help support and keep these videos coming. Channel patrons do get a fair few advantages, seeing certain videos early, regular votes to see what sort of things happen next on the channel, and automatic entry into the regular prize giveaways, with a chance to win some big model kits each month. If any of that sounds good to you, or you'd just like to help support, the link is down in the video description. In any case, a massive thank you for listening, and I'll hope to see you guys next time.